So the next section in this book, The Outline of Sanity, has to do with machinery. And I am going to take that as a fairly broad concept, meaning not just, factory machinery per se, but mechanization and automation. Because I think that this is how Chesterton is perceiving it. It's not just the machine per se, as in the physical machine, but the machinery that, that people had built up in the way of organizing themselves to produce as well. The previous section, as you'll recall, was about agriculture, and he had promoted the idea of returning agriculture to a lot of smaller proprietors to the extent possible, with the outcome of more people having an independent way of life, being able to supply their local area, and basically be better citizens as a result, to return a certain chunk of the proletariat, you might say, to small land ownership and small production for their local area. In this one, this section, he deals with the rest of the proletariat, you might say. How do we incorporate or use distributive ideas in the rest of the population? Well, in the first chapter, he talks about, should we destroy machinery like the Luddites? And he does this in a very playful way, okay? And he doesn't end up actually recommending that we destroy all machinery, right? Or that destroying machinery is even the best way to handle anything at all. Rather, machinery has to be brought under the control of people. So he more than senses, that machinery has become, and this was the 1920s, but the machinery had become sort of the overlord of people. And it was being used in ways and deployed in ways that actually did not benefit most people, but led to drudgery and routinization and these growing class differences where many people just weren't able to participate in the profits and well-being generated by this machinery. So he says, now we don't necessarily wish to destroy every sort of machinery, but we do desire to destroy a certain sort of mentality. And that is precisely the sort of mentality that begins by telling us that nobody can destroy machinery. So I got to thinking about what this would mean for our times. And I do remember reading about a tool that is being marketed to police departments right now that has to do with gathering up all of the photos that people put of themselves on the internet, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever. And an algorithm that basically can run your photo or whatever piece of information you have about a person through this huge database of photos and learn more about, more about the whereabouts and so forth of people. And I when I read about this, I thought, my God, what kind of power is this? This is not good. It's not good for people's privacy or safety. Do we really want this to be used by anything, whether it's, police departments or private investigation agencies or whatever it may be? And usually when you raise these kinds of objections, what you will get in response, even from people who don't like what's going on, how this technology is being used, they'll say, well, the genie's out of the bottle, we can't put it back. This is just the way it is. This is the way things are going. We are kind of helpless to stop it. And this is the mentality that Chesterton is rather strenuously and with quite a bit of humor pushing back on in this chapter. So he repeatedly says, well, wait a minute, like basically, are we free willing people or are we automatons? Are we products completely of our environment? Are we sort of the detritus of history here, or do we have the will? If we have like freedom of will, then it is just not true that we could not decide what machinery, what mechanisms, what systems, and in our case now, what algorithms or what software we actually want to use. We could decide not to use. And he actually mentioned some of the old, mechanisms of torture and how over time, supposedly, society had become more sophisticated and more humane and decided that those were machines that shouldn't be enhanced. Now, I have to say, looking in hindsight, we may, not have the Iron Maiden anymore, but I think that indeed, the technology of torture did continue to grow and to uh, more or less mutate into something even more harmful than it was. So he's fighting against the modern notion of inevitable progress, and of inevitable progress being defined as technical progress. And he's fighting against what Ellul was writing about, Jacques Ellul, in the technological society, of this sort of self-rolling wheel that once it gets started, you cannot stop. And there's no way to kind of decide what lends itself to human happiness and what does not. Okay. So he always uses quite a bit of humor. I will confess that at a certain point, I become a little bit humorless when it comes to things like this. And so I actually do kind of like read over some of the more like witty parts of this, even though from a literary perspective, it's probably great writing, but I try to get to the point. And the great thing about Chesterton is he does actually always come back to his main point after he goes through all these different jokes. He mentions the Luddites and he criticizes the Luddites, the sect that basically, was all about breaking the machinery, just breaking it all. And he calls it a blind revolt against some ancient and awful dragon. And it basically says that this approach is just about as stupid as the other approach, which is just sort of blind and naive acceptance of any and all technological innovation, that you can't stop it and it all is just kind of out of our control. What is needed, he says, is a measured response in which we first think about what actually makes us happy. And so he does insist in these chapters on the eudaimonistic motivation, the standard of eudaimonia, or happiness, meaning probably more than just, like, I don't know what you would call it, like giddy, pleasure or whatever, but rather satisfaction, contentment, peace, these kinds of things. We have to figure out what will give us those things, because he's basically assuming that this is what people want, which is not a bad assumption. But I mean, people act as though that's not true. But anyway, if he's right, then many of the things that we do with our machinery do not lead to our satisfaction, contentment, or other forms of happiness, but complicate our lives, maybe even enslave us to a certain extent, fill our lives with work, uh, sort of drain us of our wealth and or potential wealth, future wealth, so that we can't accumulate anything. So one of the things he proposes towards the end of this chapter, when it comes to machinery, people, I guess, were saying, well, how can you distribute machinery? Because you can't break a factory up into parts and give it to different people, which is kind of a dumb argument on its face. So he deals with this by, of course, saying, no, we can't do that. That would be a bad idea, but rather we can actually distribute the profit, the substance of what is created across the people employed in it. So basically, he's arguing for the employees, at the very least, of whatever manufacturing entity it is, to receive equal benefit from that. Okay, kind of like true shareholders. And he criticizes the capitalists for doing some half-hearted measure, like perhaps today it might be, oh, our employees are shareholders too. Part of their compensation is our shares. Never mind the fact that most of the shares are held by other people, and only a small fraction are held by employees, right? So he is arguing that we could indeed make the employees equal shareholders, equal owners, benefiting from any of the profits and substance that come out of what they do. So he says, uh, Now, there are many schemes having this normal and general character, almost any one of which I should prefer to the concentration presented by capitalism or promised by communism. Concentration, that is, of wealth and property. So he's saying that both capitalism and communism concentrate material goods into the hands of a few people who then make all the decisions and basically get to deploy it. So he is saying any of the schemes related to redistributing property as far as these, more of these machinery settings, factory and more urban settings, any of those schemes would be better than what is supplied by either capitalism or communism. He says, my own preference on the whole would be that any such necessary machine should be owned by a small local guild on principles of profit sharing, or rather profit dividing, but of real profit sharing and real profit dividing, not to be confounded with capitalist patronage. All right, so real profit dividing would be, I would have to gather, equal profit dividing, which is not the case with most of those schemes. Okay. He also has a chapter called The Romance of the Machinery here, where he basically contrasts between a person who is fascinated with machinery and sort of sees it as quasi-miraculous and almost like a toy, something that can enhance your life, but isn't ultimately your life or doesn't govern your life. And the many people, most people, for whom the machinery becomes just another source of drudgery and monotonous routine, compliance. So the engineer, he says, might be just like giddy with whatever the latest contraption or innovation that he's made, how the machine works. The average person who has to live with it experiences it as a form of uniformity and compliance and, yes, conformity. And so, this again leads to the question, what is machinery for? Okay. Um, should it have become this almost, yes, this mode of dominance over people? Or should we have been able to see the machinery that we did create, the technological innovations we did and do create, as enhancements to our happiness and well-being, and only that? And what would we have to do to make sure that they did that and didn't become, the thing that basically, keeps track of our every waking moment and tells us exactly what to do for every waking moment that we're at work and oftentimes at home as well. It's hard for us to imagine the sense of oppression that he probably had in the 1920s, because we live under that now. Ultimate time consciousness, tracking, tracking and surveillance of our work, and even our private life, the blending of our work and private life, and all of these things that we now kind of consider as normal. But he was on the horizon of these things. So here's a great quote from this chapter. He says, let's see, the whole of industrial society is founded on the idea that rapid and regular transit and transport, perpetual interchange of goods, and incessant communication between remote places is of all things the most economical and direct. But it is not true that the quickest and cheapest thing for a man who has just pulled an apple from an apple tree is to send it in a consignment of apples on a train that goes like a thunderbolt to the market at the end of the other end of England, or you might say now the other end of the world. The quickest and cheapest thing for a man who has pulled a fruit from a tree is to put it in his mouth. He is the supreme economist who wastes no money on railway journeys. So, he's in a very beautiful, kind of funny way, he's pointing out the ultimate inefficiency of the routines and the organizational structure of capitalism. In this way, his critique very much represents, or at least I should say resembles, the socialist critique. It is truly not efficient when you measure it by people's actual well-being and amount of effort to take the apple all the way to the other end of England to package it and then send it off to some other place to be eaten. It may ultimately make somebody profit, but it is not actually the most efficient way to get food into the mouths of people. And that's all he's pointing out here. And in that critique, he shares that very much with the socialists, who will say, this is the ultimate issue with capitalism, is it makes people do many things in the name of profit that are not really good for people, not efficient, not, and this is the most important point they make, not the best use of human labor. A lot of human labor is dumped into things that are not necessary and do not lead to the well-being of others or of themselves. So he says the case for simplification does stand as solid as an apple tree. Insofar as men can produce their own goods on the spot, they are saving the community a vast expenditure, which is often quite out of proportion to the return. This made me think of 3D printing. I know, like that may, who knows? Either you think this is realistic or you think that I'm now in sci-fi land. It depends on what you think of all of this stuff. But it seems to me quite plausible that if we wanted to, we could create a situation where a lot of the goods that we need could be manufactured on a small scale in our local area with the right kind of systems. It's just that that's not the way we've developed. It is perhaps at this point, we have the technology to do that. It would probably be more efficient. Okay. It would definitely use less fossil fuels and expense in transportation. And we could do it, or if we can't now with everything, we probably could do a lot more in short order if we really put our minds to it. Not everything, but a lot of what we needed could be more locally made with technologies like that, right? So technology can either be in the service of making changes that make things better for people and more efficient, or not. And I think among other things, Chesterton agrees with the socialists that, the profit motive is the ultimate motive. He's not wanting to totally eliminate the profit motive, but the profit motive as the ultimate motive gets in the way of efficiency and of well-being. And for him, this is just a fact. And it's a fact that then leads him courageously to say, okay, what else can we do? And oh, by the way, we know capitalism is not working too well for a lot of people. We also know that the communism that these people had experienced, it wasn't working too well for people. So it's actually fairly reasonable for him to say, is there a third way? Is there another way that that avoids the pitfalls of both? And is there a way that we can use what we've learned and what we've built up to the advantage of people rather than to the detriment of an awful lot of people? Okay, that's all for now. I think I've done a pretty decent job of giving you the spirit of this particular section. I'll probably do one more video on this. I may deal a little bit more with this section and then his conclusion. I hope you've enjoyed so far G.K. Chesterton. Do check out my notes below, because I've got a link to a sign-up sheet where you can get more information about a seminar I'm going to offer this summer on distributism. I'm also considering, and probably will do, some impromptu lectures on another site on a variety of topics throughout the summer. And so that mailing list will get you information about those as I decide to do them. All right, well, you have a good weekend, and I'll be back next week with more Chesterton.